So, as I mentioned, our youth are off this morning to Alabama for their mission trip, Tuskegee, Alabama. And they'll share with us in a couple of weeks, the first Sunday of March, which is the Sunday right before Lent begins. They'll share with us a bit about their experience. And if you've listened to the youth share about these mission trip experiences, you know how profound they can be in their lives and how their sharing of that is a profound thing for us. It is a wonderful thing that our church encourages in the kids a sense of service and mission, and they return often with some pretty profound God moments from these trips. It's also an opportunity for them to turn outwards, away from their stressful lives and the expectations that we can put on them, the pressures of school, of achievement, of success. I have to say this morning I wondered how much their anxiety level dropped when they got into those vans and headed off to the airport and out of Winchester. Did you know that the National Institute for Mental Health estimates that 30% of teens and 20% of teen boys have anxiety disorders? I mean, 100% of them have anxiety, because that's a part of being human, and for sure, a human teenager. But 20 to 30% of teens have an anxiety to the level of disorder, leading to substance abuse, cutting, debilitating fears, etc. And I wonder if you look at communities like ours, if you'd find that percentage increased, even with the pressures of parental educational levels and career success that marks highly affluent areas like ours in the shadow of Harvard and MIT and other elite schools. Even outside of that, though, wouldn't you agree that to a certain extent we seem to be an anxious people, living in an anxious land, in an age of anxiety? And if that is true, of course, our children will bear that anxiety in themselves. And so we should pay special heed to the many scriptures that tell us not to fear. The scriptures focus on this at times. Do not worry. Release anxiety by the way of trusting in God. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. They are like trees who spread their roots out by the stream and are not anxious in times of drought. Truly blessed are they. And don't we also feel the curse of anxiety when we've lost touch with that benevolent presence of God in our lives and in our world? How many of us and our children live these days with a chronically low-grade sense of threat around every corner, whether that's with our finances, wondering when the stock market will next crash, or where the next mass shooting will come from. And I have to say, I wrote the draft of my sermon and wrote that statement on Thursday afternoon. Within 20 hours, the next mass shooting came in Aurora. This low-grade sense of threat. For many Americans, there's this fear of what the next disturbing proclamation will come from the highest office in our land. For others, the next climate catastrophe. To say nothing that if you are a woman walking through an empty parking lot to your car at night, or a black man being pulled over by the police. How many of us live with this low-level or maybe high-level sense of threat that we simply have gotten used to, that accompanies us to bed at night and departs with us as we leave the house in the morning? And while that might be true for the majority of us who are still able to function and get through our days, raise our families, make it through the world, there are others of us, tortured souls among us, who seem to bear a heavier weight of all that anxiety. to the level of psychological disorder, which means that the sense of threat has reached such a level that they are rendered incapable, many of them, of daily functioning. It becomes, we know how these disorders have been labeled very well these days, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress, social anxiety disorder, or general anxiety disorder. These are God's children who, for whatever reason, because of misfirings of the brain or memories stored in the body or triggers from trauma, are unable to manage that interior sense of threat like the rest of us, and as a result are overwhelmed and incapacitated at times by fear. A friend of Tracy and mine who has been diagnosed with general anxiety disorder thinks it can be traced back to her childhood with a hyper-religious mother who was constantly warning her about the wiles and seductions of the devil that lay around every corner, this as a very young girl. And the importance of being faithful to God to protect your soul. Talk about a number. Her vulnerable brain and psyche at a very young age simply got into patterns of feeling extremely threatened. She's since, as an adult, found enormous relief through therapy and medication, as well as renewed and healthier engagement with her faith. But there are still moments when in the aisle of a grocery store, for a reason she can't quite understand, with all their hundreds of options laid before her, she becomes near immobilized with the onset of a panic attack. When she's aware that she's in a particularly vulnerable state, she asks her partner to grocery shop for her because she's conscious now of how she can be triggered. And of course, with this disorder, rational explanation, there's nothing in the grocery. Does very little to affect the response that fires from the body or the brain or wherever it comes from. Right? You know this, those of you who, and I'm sure we all have those people in our lives who struggle with anxiety. So the Christian philosopher Soren Kierkegaard would not be surprised by our friend's response in the grocery store as he connects anxiety to our very freedom to choose as human beings. He considers the example of a person standing on a cliff's edge, where he experiences both the extremely focused fear of falling, but also a terrifying impulse to throw himself off the edge. Anxiety derives from our utter and total freedom to choose either of those. Stay put or throw oneself to one's death. Kierkegaard referred to this as the dizziness of freedom, saying in the Garden of Eden, in the story of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, anxiety preceded sin. He said it was the moment that God told not to eat the fruit of the tree of good and evil that Adam had the anxiety-producing realization, you mean I can eat from the tree of the Garden of Good and Evil? The realization that he was free and had a choice to either obey God or not. That anxiety preceded the sin of choosing against God and eating from the tree. So there's something essentially human about anxiety. It's what can keep us alive, right? And well and aligned to God and God's purposes for our lives, but it can lead in the other direction too. Sin follows from anxiety when the freedom to choose leads us to choose separation from God. So the healthy human being is ordered in such a way to have that freedom of choice. It's what makes us human, that we can stop and think about and consider which way to go and decide the one we want to choose. And it is to such as these that Jeremiah's words are reaching. Cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and who do not look to God or put their trust in God. They are like dried up shrubs in the desert. But blessed are those who trust. They are like trees rooted by the stream who are just in times of drought. And it's making me anxious that my mic keeps on going out, I have to say. Do you hear that? Is my mic going out? Okay, so Janice, will you turn this off and this on for me? Because I'm not going to sit here being... Okay, or I'll just yell. Okay, there we go. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. They are like trees rooted by the stream who are not anxious in times of drought. So Jeremiah is also speaking to a terribly anxious people who are just on the verge of being exiled from their land by the Babylonians. And he's encouraging them, this trust in God is what can help manage your fears and your anxiety in this. In our anxious, materialistic culture and age, it is a worthy warning that we should heed, and we need to develop ways to foster the choice toward God through spiritual practice and prayer and study, such that we can release our anxiety and trust that ultimately all of this is held by a benevolent hand, ultimately, trusting that whatever may come, in the end, it all passes and falls away, and God holds us. But let's be clear, then, as we say that many of those with mental illness, including anxiety disorders, are not in need of exhortation against lack of trust. You must trust in God more, so much as they are in need of healing. Healing, which might come from divine intervention in healing prayer, or through psychotherapy, or through medication, or a combination of all those. So it's an important question to ask, are we sick or are we sinning? Are you and I anxious about many things and separating ourselves from God in a way that we need to be challenged on? Or have we, for whatever reason, lost something of our fundamental human capacity to choose, standing immobilized in the cereal aisle, for instance, and in need of healing? In some instances, many instances, is probably both and. Some of us might need healing and also a reminder of the ways we separate ourselves from God and might restore that relationship again. And for sure, all of us need communities like this community of faith that foster trust and peace and connectedness to one another and to something higher than ourselves. We need this in a culture of individualism, isolation, and materialism. For I think those with psychological disorders also say something about the orders of our society. There have been many times when I've been in the grocery store myself and I've thought of my friend, and as I've looked down that aisle at over 100 different choices for one single item like cereal, and I've thought to myself, maybe she doesn't have the disorder. Maybe our culture that equates freedom with an obscene number of choices has the disorder. Maybe we should all feel a little dread at the very edge of the abyss of so many choices that in the end mean nothing. Does our consumer culture use up all our precious human capacity for freedom and creativity on trifles? So there's little of us left for deeper questions of what it means to be human and what our purpose is. Is our precious human capacity for freedom and creativity used up on trifles in our culture? I think I'll choose frosted mini-wheats. No, I'll choose life. Actually, cinnamon life. Really? Are we choosing life? Are we choosing life? My wife loves Life cereal. I mean, it's called Life. Maybe our friends and family, our children with anxiety or with anxiety disorders can also highlight for us the disordered nature of our society and call us all towards the critical work of creating communities that are gentler, simpler, less anxious, more supportive. How do we make sure that we are holding and fostering a church community that is less anxious and gentler, a gentler place to be? A place where, as the Apostle Paul puts it, we rejoice in the Lord always and trust that the Lord is very near, letting our gentleness be known to all. And instead of compounding anxiety upon anxiety by prayer and petition and with thanksgiving, we let our requests be made known to God. A place like that. Then he says we'll find together that the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard our hearts and guard our minds in Christ Jesus. This is the promise.